Welcome everybody to the CISO Live, this week's Future of MSPs, dealing with governance, risk, and compliancy. We appreciate you attending today. There is no selling. We try to make this a value and informative webinar, and hopefully we can make it a little entertaining as well. So really quick, I'd like to do some introductions. First off, we have David Dreswicki, who is the CEO and executive of Absolute Dental Organization. Thank you for joining us today, David. Next, we have James Nicholas from Tagunya.
Absolutely great to meet you all. I'm the VP of IT over here at Tagunya.
Thank you, James. And then we have our very own Robert Davies, CEO of Stealth-ISS Group, going to be on the panel today.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining. And thanks for watching the video if you didn't make it live. Back to you, David.
All right. Well, let's get started. First question, our topic area is what to look for in a good MSP. I'm going to throw that one over to David.
Sure. So what to look for in a good MSP. So while I'm currently the chief executive over here at Absolute Dental, I have to admit, I have a chief information technology title in my past. So I'm dangerously educated in the technology world, which probably gives me a good leg up of what I need to look for. So what I would look for typically is number one, first and foremost, can they do the job? So reputation of skill. We need to make sure that with ever-changing technology, we can do more than just reset passwords. We're actually, thinking about the future from a strategic perspective, whether we do that through reference checks, whether we do that through their list of customers they currently serve and understand the complexity of the environments. Reputation of skill, in my mind, trumps what needs to be done here, because that's what we're paying for as someone who's trying to find that MSP. Second is responsiveness. Guys like me are really impatient, especially since I've like to think I've been there, done most of that or all of that. And anything that I do takes 2 minutes, at least in my mind, right? And so guys like me and companies like me, and in all seriousness, customers that get served, where they're serving patients in healthcare, we need responsive solutions. If something is down for some reason, which typically happens, we just need reliable and response times. And then thirdly, I would say just self-accountability. If you're out looking for an MSP, if we're out looking for an MSP, which we have, we've chosen not to do it ourselves. And if we've chosen not to do it ourselves, we need someone who's going to be self-directed, self-accountable. And I'm not looking to follow up every day with someone as much as if we find a reputable MSP who can A, do the job, B, they're responsive. They have to really, kind of lead their own direction, if you will, because I don't know, again, I'm dangerously educated on what's out there today in the technology platforms and the strategy of such, tactics as such, et cetera. So that's how I think about, what I look for in a good MSP.
I'd love to share a little bit here as well. I think importantly, those are great things to look for, and to help give everybody listening some color on how you can establish it. You want to make sure that when you're talking to a new MSP and you're trying to find the right MSP, that they are spending time listening to your concerns and understanding what your business needs are. An MSP that comes in and is just saying, I don't really care what your business actions are, or how you operate, but here's how we prescribe your technology, is not one that's ever going to be able to truly help your business succeed. And you should be looking for an MSP that's aiming to partner with you and aiming to really help bring things to the table for you. If they have technology that can pair well with what you're doing, that's great. But really you want somebody you want to know that they have people there that are thinking about your business, considering how that technology can fit into your business design and helping you make that objective happen. So if they're not sitting down with you or bringing things to your attention and educating you, then they're not doing one of the most important pieces there. As much as you might be familiar with the technology, and just like David, even if whether you describe yourself as technology illiterate or dangerous with technology, or you think you're a full expert, you want an MSP that's coming to the table, helping fill in the gaps you might have, because nobody knows anything, nobody knows everything. I think that's kind of the point of what we're talking about here today too.
Well,
So
thank you, James.
So
Appreciate that.
let me,
if I could, my closing
Yeah.
sentence, the point is that your MSP needs to be able to admit where their boundaries end. What are they not able to do?
Well
And if you're
said.
talking to an MSP that says they can do everything, either they're God or they're lying. And if they are God, I'd like to meet them in person.
I need to jump in.
Yeah.
I need to jump in. So if you took all of those answers, you could change the question to be what to look for in a good MSSP as well. They have to be listen first, understand your business, understand your risks, be expert in their field, and know where their boundaries are. It's exactly the same. And I know this conversation will evolve into discussing the finer details and differences between MSPs and MSSPs. But if you're on the client side and whatever service it is that you're looking for, do your due diligence, research, make sure that they're responsive to you, listening to you, and they're asking questions that lead you to believe that they understand you, your business, your operating context, and will do the right thing for you.
Thank you, Robert. That brings up a good point in the investigative process as you're exploring new vendors. Request references. Get to talk to some of their clients. I think would definitely be a key point. And then to James' point about you can't be all things to all people. James, tell us the importance of a client or potential client asking the MSP if they offer anything beyond managed IT services. Yep. What kind of insights is that going to give them about that organization?
Yeah, fantastic question. So when you're talking to any managed service provider, you're looking for specific needs to be met, and they might be able to do a lot of different things. And in fact, you might find an MSP can cover the majority of your specific needs, but they really should have boundaries as to how far that can go. As a case and example, at Tagunya, we do a lot of different things for infrastructure, and it is a lot. You talk about phones, and you can talk about servers, and you talk about networking, but our focus is configuration to meet security and business objectives, right? It has to be able to have a focus. And our background as an organization, it has a market we focus on. We tend to focus in markets that are in manufacturing, wholesale distribution around ERPs. Well, when you look at that and you look at any other MSP, they should have something in that space, and it should be a good alignment to your business, whatever that is. When you're looking through the specific technology, if the MSP is telling you that they can help with all of your regulation compliance, they can help you with file your taxes, and they can give you a shoe shine as well, they're branching into spaces that they probably shouldn't. But you can even focus it in further. There are plenty of very good MSPs that all they can help you with is endpoint support or endpoint and servers, and they're not going to really do phones. They'll have you get a different phone vendor. Or maybe they won't do printers because there are guys that just specialize on printing. So they say, hey, have a contract with those guys. And that same thing can exist in the security space, and all aspects of IT can be broken out. And you want to see that they are able to admit that there are limits to what they do.
Yeah, James, I've got to add to that. So that's further enhanced or complicated depending on your point of view on the governance, risk and compliance framework under which you're operating. So just as an example, for those that aren't aware, federal supply chain is now covered by a thing called CMMC, which is Cybersecurity Maturity Model. You can provide an assessment to a company, you can remediate the things that you found as part of that assessment, but you cannot perform the certification. The advisory board of the CMMC mandates you must use a different company. So basically it comes back to you can't mark your own homework when it comes to the GRC space.
Thank you, Robert. That's a great point. Before we get on to the next area, a couple more points. Is it important, and I'll throw this one back to James, and then if David wants to add in, is it important to ask your MSP that you're considering if they outsource any part of their support?
Yeah, I think it's very important that you understand how the support and the service is being delivered. because it has a direct implication on their control and also the liability or risk that could exist for those people working inside of your space. If you have a managed service provider and what they're actually doing is they have a person in front of you, but they have a different company doing everything behind the scenes, now you're not actually just contracting with one company, you're contracting with more than one company. And you have to be able to understand what that looks like, and it should be disclosed and upfront. It shouldn't be a hidden thing. Importantly as well, the nature of how they're outsourcing it could be indicative of the quality of service you're going to end up with. I'm not going to say anything to disparage specific regions or methods of outsourcing, but I will say that a tight partnership is not the same as somebody buying a product that they're reselling, which is still further not the same as somebody getting contractors that are not actually full-time employees of an organization. And each of those are different ways that an MSP sometimes outsources the responsibility. You want to know that the company that you're engaging with, at the end of the day, is able to take full responsibility of the things that they are scoping for you.
100% underscore what James said. The reality of it is their risk is our risk as the client, right? And so I prefer, and maybe this is bias, I prefer that it's not outsourced through outsourcing, meaning you have multiple levels of folks that are outsourcing. I agree, products is something different, but when you have people, subcontractors being outsourced and have multiple side gigs and side hustles across different various companies, it just creates more risk. And I'm more of the old school fan of, if I'm outsourcing to MSPA, then MSPA is employing all of those individuals, because ultimately they're on the hook. I'm taking the risk, and I want to make sure that they protect me there.
A comment to volley back in the same space. You mentioned side hustles. This is a very common thing in MSPs, especially when you look at the smaller ones, where they'll have a number of people that it's like they're just calling their buddy that they go drinking with to come solve a problem for them. That's not a business that you want to be able to engage in that space. Now, there's nothing wrong with a small MSP, a couple man shop that's doing a specific thing for you, but you also have to recognize that the smaller the group that you're working with, you have to consider that they have the limitations inherent to one person can't do everything around the clock. So understanding your own business needs start to become a important consideration on expectations you set when you're searching out the MSP. Know that if you're a 24/7 operation, you'll need an MSP that can facilitate that type of operation.
Okay, from a GRC perspective, it's about third-party risk. So in some cases like CMMC, you have to cascade the requirements through your third parties. So yeah, very good. Where did they go?
So to kind of pull forward in this, when you're talking through and trying to understand what a managed service provider can do and are they a good fit for you, as much as they're trying to size out, like, can they get your business? You really want to be able to understand, are they familiar with your industry? So if it's all right, next kind of reference here is exactly that, references. You should be talking to the MSPs that you're discussing to say, can you demonstrate references in that space? Can you show that you have experience with businesses like your own?
I think that's absolutely critical, by the way, because our MSP happens to have almost several dozen, perhaps, businesses in the dental vertical, and the dental vertical is more of it's behind the scenes, behind the times of technology, as far as technology goes, for sure, probably 10, 20 years. But certainly they already having access to dental knowledge and understanding regulatory and compliance within this industry has been extremely helpful, as well as understanding some of the archaic technology that the dental industry deploys is helpful, because we're all sharing very similar, if not the same, products across these dozen or so companies. And so I already have built-in expertise, as opposed to trying to find it and do multiple MSPs or multiple folks, or hiring people for that matter. So same industry, absolutely. You'll know exactly where you stand when you do these reference checks.
Thank you, David. That was a great point. We have Another, well, it's really more of a statement, not a question, but talking about be certain that a provider accountability is written into the service level agreement. Since you signed a lot of those, David, do you want to address, MSAs, SLAs, how important it is to really understand what they're delivering, that they can say everything they want in a meeting, but you better have that in writing.
Yeah, it's absolutely important to have in writing. Unfortunately, though, I think a lot of guys like me sign these and then we kind of check the box and move on to the next fire that might be brewing, right, or burning. And you don't empower somebody to hold your MSP accountable to those SLAs. And it just comes down to simple communication. I've said to my team time and time again, and over the years where they'll say, well, so-and-so, always pointing to an MSP or an outsourced offshore group, so-and-so didn't do what they were supposed to do. And I have to, kind of step back and say, listen, so-and-so is your team. That their SLA is your SLA. Mm-hmm. Their accountability is your accountability. And really, I don't see that more as an MSP challenge. I see it more as an internal cultural challenge with again, guys like me who sign these things and just kind of move on to the next topic. You really have to hold your internal team accountable, which creates, they don't always know the ins and the outs and the bits and the bytes of what they're signing up to from SLAs and not even know what to ask for in some cases. So I go back to James' point of, if the MSP is listening to your needs, they will come forth with an SLA. A good MSP in my mind will come forward with a good SLA of what's appropriate for your type of operation. If you're a 24/7 operation, if you're seeing clients, patients, et cetera, in real time, you have different needs than maybe a non-real time type organization. So accountability starts from within is how I would answer that.
I'd love to share a little bit related to what it means to have a good SLA and how someone listening to this might be able to decide whether or not an SLA is going to meet your need. So first, when you're looking at any kind of service level agreement, understanding the objectives, the SLOs, service level objectives underneath it, is really important. What are the objectives that they're setting, and do those objectives line out to what you're looking for? Some might give you objectives that are specifically targeted to responsiveness and not necessarily targeted to resolution. Others might be targeted to resolution, but they may not be actually, guaranteeing they're going to communicate with you. And, just because they got the problem solved doesn't matter if you didn't know about it. Great. We've been up since this morning, but nobody knew, so nobody's been working. It doesn't help. And there's individual considerations that you might want to look at. What are they guaranteeing they're going to do? How are they communicating, right? A lot of SLAs are going to cover what method can you reach out to them and how will they reach back out to you, or who your contacts are. And these are all things to consider and measure according to your business need. You don't need a 30-minute SLA response time if you're an organization that doesn't have a business need for that level of response. But if you're in an industry where you need that quick response, it's maybe worth paying for. And understanding what means oftentimes difficult when you're trying to figure out what you want there is to be able to size the engagement. It's hard sometimes to know what you can ask for and how much that's going to impact your costs. So that can become an important consideration. Asking for 24/7 versus, 8x5 support windows can make a difference in price for some organizations, but some MSPs, you may not have a cost difference really because it's just the way they operate. So these are good questions for you to ask when you're going through that SLA process. Do they offer it? And if they do, does it cost more? And that can all play into your deciding factor. Is this the right fit for you? I do have a question for you, actually, David.
Yes.
What would you say is the most important SLA, individual objective about an SLA for either an MSP or an MSSP that you'd want to see? What's an individual objective that you think would be most important from your perspective?
You're asking this, David?
You know what? Either David can answer it, but yeah, this David.
I'm of the opinion it's resolution. I was laughing as you were talking about, with that SLA of response versus resolution. That is a very gray line that most people skim, not to mention the communication piece. I've had, over the years, working with certain MSPs, have had more struggle in the communication. And you're right, people, they don't know the system's back up. And so they just go and do what they need to do. But I center around responsiveness, that resolution, response, great, you hear about it, that's awesome. Resolution is what's most important to me. How do we get it done, and how do we get it done in a timely manner? That's SLA #1 to me.
Appreciate that. Robert, do you have anything to add to that?
Resolution's a tricky one because a lot of it depends on whether you have a disaster recovery or BCP site stood up. Sometimes it's asking companies to measure how long a piece of string might be, because it really depends on what the problem is. So that for me is where that for me is where communication is key, because as long as the MSP or MSSP is very open and says, hey, you know what, this is from our vocabulary, this is a 0-day exploit. We've got companies around the globe working on fixing that and understanding what the hash is and the malware. So you frankly cannot put a resolution time on that. What you can do is do your best. And secondly, as I say, what you can do is communicate openly, freely, and oftenly as to what's going on. And also, I don't think we're going to cover it today, but business continuity is a bit of a hot button for me. So, when was the last time you tested your business continuity plan, just in case all SLAs are out the window? So,
that's a great.
Go ahead. Sorry,
great point, Robert. With disaster recovery and business continuity, a lot of times, sometimes the client may be putting undue expectations on you that, yes, you did backups. Yes, you have those things in place, but does the client really understand a full recovery or restore from a ransomware or something that could be 5 days to have everything restored? And they think because the backup's there, I'll be up tomorrow. And so, the resolution, the misunderstanding on the client side too.
We expect to be back up tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, expect what you like. I need to toot our horn just a little bit, because this was public. This is not a sales pitch. This is just to explain David's point. So we were the company on site in Pyeongchang for the Winter Olympics that were hacked by a nation state 2018. And, we have tools that can go, find all sorts of things. We had to take our time, finding the malware and finding the hash for the malware, and then searching through months and months and months of backups to find the most recent backup where the malware and the hash was not present. And that was 6 months worth of data we had to troll through to take the company back to a safe restore point. So yeah, that by itself can take a while. And then guess what? Your data is 6 months stale. So you're going to have to rekey the most important parts of that. And rebuild all of your infrastructure. So yeah, my analogy about how long is a piece of string, that one was about 5 days long.
A fun consideration in that same space, many of you listening might be familiar or have heard in the news last year, there was a CVE that was colloquially named Print Nightmare. Well, Print Nightmare was ongoing problem. And so this is a really simple point back to understanding the difference between what an SLA is promising and how it's scoped, because there is no SLA you're ever going to get that's going to include a scope that'll cover things like maybe Print Nightmare, because the whole industry had to wait for solutions to be able to push it down, and it impacted everyone. And you'd take a step to try and remediate or work around it, and it would just give you other issues. Microsoft, for a while during Print Nightmare, effectively said, stop printing. That was their.
Well, look at the SolarWinds hack. I mean, how many resolutions were there, released to market before that thing died down? WannaCry was another one. So, yes. Did we answer the question, or did we go?
Yeah, I think we did. We diverged a little bit, but no worries. I think people are getting some entertainment, if nothing else, out of that.
I hope so.
We're moving on to the next group of questions. So it's your business, it's your data, trust but verify. This is an important one, and I'm going to throw it to David. How do you assess an MSP on managing your own data?
it's very difficult, honestly. I'm a big believer in inspect what we expect. And I do spot verifications on my business all the time, every day, without even realizing it. But to do the same with an MSP, it becomes more difficult. Again, being in the lane of dangerously educated, how I've learned to spot verify certain things, whether it's around data or infrastructure or even technology strategy for that matter in an MSP, is just, again, asking questions. It's all about going back to what Robert said. It's communication. You know, tell me what the plan is on. Tell me when we last did X. Tell me give me the exception report of Y. And just asking, and you realize where the depth of the pool is very quickly. When you get a lot of, deer in the headlight looks, you know exactly where you are. And trust and verify, and just asking questions continues to be the way that I spot verify or spot, hold people accountable, or try to make sure I know where we are as an organization. Because the reality of it is my data. And that's why I tend to go, again, my recommendation tends to be go with an MSP that understands your environment, your industry, your technology tools, and is already familiar with it, because the depth of their expertise is likely going to be much deeper, as opposed to the sexy new software that no one knows how to do, or the oddball software 15 years old that 3 people support it, right? It's a tough question to ask, and you really just gotta get comfortable with being uncomfortable and asking the questions until you know where the bottom of the pool is.
Yeah, I think also around that, it's not just asking about your own data, understanding how the MSP manages themselves will give you a lot of insight. Like, a good question to ask an MSP is how do they assess and manage their own risk? And let them answer that. Do they have a framework? Do they have disciplines? How does the MSP manage access to the environment, to your environment and theirs? James, you want to expound on that?
I would love to expound on that. Yeah, this is near and dear to me, because the amount of energy and effort we put in to help accommodate exactly this question behind the scenes, it's something none of my clients ever see. They never get an invoice for, but it's probably my biggest cost. And at the end of the day, it's a matter of making sure that an MSP that is working with you, if you're granting them access to their environment, you have to be able to understand that they've put in the due diligence on their tooling, that they've got isolation. I cannot tell you how many environments I've helped people with where you look at it and they're like, hey, what's this site-to-site VPN over here? Oh, this is the connection for my MSP to get into my network. And then you look at it and it's fully traversable, and you can see on the other side, there's route tables that show 50 other customers. And now your network is also these other customers' networks, and that's a problem. And that's just one example of like many, many that could be there. So understanding how they're getting in so that they're telling you that it's encrypted. Here's the challenge. If you're not an IT person and you're working with an MSP, how do you ask the right questions to know that they are taking this seriously? And specifically, what you're looking to know is that they have reputable products that they're leveraging, and that they are expressing in writing to you, not just in words, that these products have encryption in motion and at rest. And that when you talk to them about data, you want to know that if there is a breach, they're going to disclose it. And you want to know that they have least privilege functionality as far as how they manage it, that not every employee they have has access to every customer's data that might exist. And lastly, this is really important. Unless you have a specific use case for your business where you need them to take a copy of your data into their facility, you want to know that they're not owning your data at the same time as you're owning your data.
Yeah, and that brings in another dimension of GDPR and all sorts of weirdness. So yeah, couldn't agree more with that. What I would like to offer folks on this call and anyone watching the video, we will put together a list of, working with James and David as well, we'll put together a list of, I don't know, top 50, however many questions it might be, questions to ask your MSP. I think that would be of value. It won't take us long to put together, and folks can hopefully get a better outcome with that. So yeah,
that's a great point, Robert. Another key statement or question to ask, I think, would be, how are the MSP's practices in managing privileged account credentials, private keys, and other secrets? You know, do they have a formal process, or do they manage configuration changes in their internal systems? How do they record that? How do they manage that? How do they check that? Because if they don't have governance around their own internal systems, if employees can come in and change things on the firewall, change things on the switches, that's putting you at risk. So
a consideration for everyone: if you're taking the time to work with an MSP or an MSSP, they should be able to educate you and demonstrate that they know more about a topic than you do. You should be able to talk to them about PKI and say, hey, how are you handling this? And they should be able to explain it to you, because if they can't explain it, you really don't have a grounds to be able to know whether or not they understand it.
So that's Einstein, isn't it? That's if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough.
Yes, one of my favorite quotes.
Well said.
Exactly. You know, next question, does the MSP retain your access logs? That brings up that point, James, you talked about who owns the data, where's the data being stored. Now, there are business cases that the MSP or MSSP, if they're doing a SIEM as a service, would control that data, and that's inherently not necessarily bad, as long as they have the right controls around it and the agreement that you're doing that service for them, and the retention of how long you're holding that.
Importantly, if I can jump in on that, access logs is a phrase that can easily be misunderstood by a non-technical person. And there's multiple different things that could be considered there. It's access to your data and what's happening inside of your environment. It might also be considering their access to your environment. It might also be considering public access to your data sets or whatever it might be. Any type of logging should be retained with appropriate measure that's in consideration to the log at question. And every industry and compliance space is going to have different requirements there. And this is actually where I think is a very tangible objective as to why most organizations are going to want to partner with both an MSSP and an MSP, so that the MSSP can set out prescriptively, this is what's necessary, and your MSP can help make sure it's done. Generally speaking, when you're looking through what you need there, it's kind of like going to the doctor and getting a prescription, but recognizing that the person that actually fills the prescription is someone else.
Very good point. David, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I just took a note literally to ask that question, to ask a couple of these points that James brought up to both my MSP, my MSSP, because I've kind of get freaked out here a little bit, because again, dangerously educated here. This is a complex topic, right?
It is.
Folks that are 4 times removed from it, like me, we're sometimes falsely make assumptions that these things are getting done, and that's why you have to have that right MSP and MSSP.
And this will be a good lead in into our next area of GRC, but one last thing, how often do you get reports from your MSP? So reporting, David, let me get a perspective from your side, what you're looking for in reports that you're getting from your MSP, and how that's been, and the type of key data points that you need to measure and make sure that your organization is running correctly. And then James, why don't you talk about reporting from your side in delivering? So David.
Sure. Yeah, I would say that the reporting that I get today is weekly, and the reporting that I get is mostly project-based as far as new projects that we're doing, because we're a growth company right now. So we're growing, and we have lots of integrations and new projects happening, and computer rollouts and refreshes and those type of things. So we're at any given moment probably managing 10 different projects that are happening with the MSP. There are reports available monthly that I don't look at as much as some of my IT lead does, and that is around statistics of uptime for systems, number of users, volume, just what am I getting what I pay for, kind of KPI metric type stuff. I'm most interested in again, I go back to response, what's getting done. And so are we pushing forward? So I would say it's weekly on those type of project-based updates, and it's religiously given to me. thoroughly, and it's pretty depth, the depth that I've asked for. They've listened to what I've wanted to see. And then the operating KPIs and metrics are given monthly based on what we think we need to see or what they've proposed for us to see. And we've tweaked that over the 5-year relationship with our MSP. As you know, as your partnerships get deeper, your metrics get deeper, your data gets deeper. I'm a data guy. I like to know as much as possible so I can make the best decisions. And some people don't like me because of that, because it creates work. But I think when we have data, it forces us to inspect what we expect to make sure things are still running. To me, it's unacceptable to run out of disk space, and I'm the guy that has to alert somebody that we're out of disk space, as a simple example.
Right. Thank you,
Absolutely.
Dave. James.
So here, I was actually very fascinated to hear what David would share, because reporting is a really intimate thing. When I look at any of my client engagements and how we operate with it, it's always a matter of what does the information tell you and can you make an action from it? Is the report intended for you to be able to know that the work is being done? Or is the report intended for you to be able to make a business decision? And the data points provided need to be indicative of what you're wanting. So from our perspective, there's so much data. You have so many different agents and things to look at. And some organizations, they just want a patch report. They want to know that patching is happening, which immediately opens up this question of, well, are you really considering what that means? And have you considered vulnerability scanning, which is an organization, something that an MSSP is often going to be handling for you, and things in that space. So when you look at reports, I advise a framework that's actually very good. Like David mentioned, if you're doing a lot of active projects, you should have weekly or biweekly, depending on how you handle sprints, conversations around project progress, as well as potential reports around case volume. So if you have a lot of cases, you might need to have reports to understand, well, what's happening and what's trending with those cases. Are you getting a lot of issues with printing? Well, if so, why aren't we solving the underlying problem to make it so we don't have so many print cases? Or maybe it's just because you have a lot of users that don't know how keyboards work. I don't know, like it depends on what's happening, right? And understanding your case trends as well as your project runs is really important to do in a tight time frame that is in line with your volume. If you only have 5 cases in a month, you probably don't need to talk about it every week. Now, shifting that to understanding the actual deliverable. Is the MSP managing the thing? Is the MSSP managing the thing that you don't necessarily have expertise in? Well, the same way you might go to a doctor and they're going to have your blood work, they need to be able to translate that blood work into something that means something for you. If they just hand you all these numbers and medical values, you're going to look at it and go, cool, that's an 8. That one's a 0.2. What does it mean? Same thing when you're looking at any kind of IT space. They should have good metrics, and the reports that make it to you should be things that translate to something that's informative about your business. How patched are your systems is a thing that a lot of people get. But what a lot of people don't get is understanding that if your server has an uptime of 90 days, that also means it hasn't been rebooted, which likely means it hasn't been patched. So if you have a 90-day uptime and everything's patched as of this week, those two things don't go together often. You can have exceptions in certain scenarios, but like normally that's the case. So my point is this: I would encourage any business that's looking for reporting from your MSSP or your MSP to share what they have and design it to allow you to make decisions. You don't necessarily have to dig into the minutia every month, because frankly, most people don't. You want to have the end result. But if you do that, I would encourage you set a schedule for yourself to be intentional about looking at the minutia behind that report, at least quarterly.
Yeah,
Appreciate
so,
that.
Thanks, James. If you got an 8 and a 0.2, you're going to die.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I think David. Hold on, David. So David said the T word, the trend word. I take these reports, and as long as I can see continuous improvement or a level of not just performance, but protection in our case that I'm paying for and expecting over time, that reaffirms my relationship with that MSP and that MSSP. So it's kind of absolutes. Oh my God, did the doodah hit the fan, or over time, can I show that I'm being serviced appropriately? That's what I look for.
Appreciate it, Robert. You know, we've been throwing out MSSP and MSP, and I think now is a good time, even though we're going to cover GRC, is understanding the delineation of those two organizations and what that means. What are the core pieces of an MSSP versus the differences of an MSP? Robert, why don't you start off with that one?
I would like first go at that. We were at a industry event a month or so ago, and we paid to join a focus group of a room full of CEOs of MSPs, and we were surprised with what we learned. What we learned was that we do not share a common understanding of what cybersecurity is. So that surprised us a bit, but what we found in a nutshell, for us, cybersecurity is about 6 different things. It's about people, process, and technology, your regular consulting kind of trio, governance, risk, and compliance. So the way we operate, we have a conversation about risk, we take that through, and then we figure out what the client really needs. The feedback, and this isn't just me saying it, the feedback from the room was that the assembled were 95% focused on just the technology aspect of those 6 areas. So yes, you know, firewalls are appliances, and you can run IDS, IPS on firewalls, and there's endpoint protection, and we kind of stray into each other's space when it comes to XDR. But typically, and I'm generalizing, so don't get upset, typically MSPs cannot necessarily have a detailed conversation about governance, risk, compliance. And you know, they care less about how well trained your staff are in the ways of cybersecurity, but they're very good at providing a platform on which your business operates. So they're absolutely essential. They provide the support staff for that. They run projects and continuously improve what it is that you're doing, so you can run your business as well as you possibly can. But they're not in the business of cybersecurity. Unfortunately, as I say, we have a shared understanding of what that actually means. Unfortunately, some MSPs do believe they are in the business of cybersecurity because they do deploy firewalls and they run antivirus. We've encountered a few of those. I think most of the world has turned and moved on now. I think, hand on heart, most MSPs recognize now that, hey, okay, this thing's far wider than we appreciated. And actually, James and David, to both of your points earlier on, you kind of have to stick to what you're good at. And we're finding that the better educated or the more aware MSPs are very happy to say, no, this is our swim lane, we're sticking in it. Client, you're asking us about risk, but here's an expert to talk to. And I think a bit later on, if we have time, we're going to talk about that relationship between MSPs and MSSPs. But for me, that's the difference between what we do. So James, David, I'd love your feedback on that.
I've got lots of opinions, but David, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, listen, it takes was it Malcolm?
Village?
Gladwell, I think, said it takes 10,000 hours to master a task, task, you know, something. And so that's 5 years full time. Just again, me in my own person and who I am, personal development. I used to think I was the guy that could do everything myself. I finally hired my own personal CPA this year. I finally have an employment agreement attorney. I finally have a trainer, a snowboard trainer, because I can't do it all myself. And you have to find experts in what they do. And I think an MSP that says they can do security, I learned that's not the case either, because again, depending on how close you are to it, and if you're a purchaser, make decision maker, and you're not an expert in security, you can easily be fooled into perhaps acquiring and thinking that a firewall, a spam filter, a antivirus software is cybersecurity, but it isn't. You really have to step back because you don't know what you don't know. And so I would wholeheartedly agree. It's a best of breed situation. You're not going to find one that does all.
For sure. So some considerations on how an MSP should be looking at it versus the reality of most MSPs. I've worked with a ton of MSPs. I partner with a lot of MSPs. Most MSPs, their end objective is to make sure your business has a piece of technology that is a platform that they can run on. And that's really the limit of where they stop most of the time. So they'll consider your people, they'll consider your processes to the extent of how do they use the tool. And they'll consider the permissions to the extent, can you log into the tool? And they might even look at that and say, well, what is governance but permission? And that's not quite accurate. That's not telling the whole story. And when they look at risk, they're going to be talking to you about disaster recovery because of risk of downtime and impact, but they're not necessarily going to be talking about PII or your exposure to data exfiltration. These are things that are risks to your organization that frankly are greater these days than the risk of a ransomware encrypting you. The risk of what happens when you have data exfiltration, that's a big deal. And threat actors are evolving. So generally speaking, I'd advise this: when you look at the difference between an MSP and an MSSP and their approach, a good MSP will understand the concepts that an MSSP does, but recognize the MSSP needs to execute it. And this is important because they have to be able to work with those things. They have to be able to see on your behalf that you have a need for this, but that does not necessarily mean that they can solve it. Just like you could go to the doctor and they can refer you to a specialist because they recognize you have the symptoms for a problem, does not necessarily mean that they can solve the problem for you. And this is where an MSP has to have that ability and is something you should be looking for in your MSP.
Thank you, James. That was a great answer. You know, that brings up a point when you're interviewing an MSP. Maybe one of the questions should be, do you partner with MSSPs? And if so, should you go interview one of the MSPs that they partner with and understand their ecosystem and vendor relationship? So,
and some larger MSPs, just as a note for everyone, will actually have sister companies that have that. This is my MSSP, this is my MSP. They'll have that situation. And so it's worth noting, do they partner? Do they have that, as a thing? But if they have, here's Bob, and he's going to do both, that's not what you're looking
right.
for.
Or they,
So
or
James,
if they
James,
never work
that's,
with an MSSP, then that's a red flag. Yeah.
Yeah.
Agreed.
So the way we do that, and this is to reinforce David's point about expertise, is we partner with many MSPs. If a client, say for example, in healthcare wanted to ask us, hey, so which MSP can you recommend to us because we're looking for one, then we would look to see who we're working with in the HIPAA space.
Yeah.
Similarly manufacturing or stuff like that. So yeah, so I hadn't realized it until David said it, but yeah, actually that's the way we roll as well, because the client is more likely to get a better outcome because the MSP has industry knowledge.
Yeah. Important note, like my group, I can work with HIPAA compliant required organizations, but I don't do anything life and death. So I won't work with a hospital, not because I don't want to or I don't like them, but because it's not a good fit. And so I will refer away that type of business. But I do know enough to be able to work with somebody that has HIPAA requirements and be able to advise what's necessary and align them out with that. So there's important considerations there that anyone you work with on either side should be comfortable to be able to help you get the correct solution, not have you buy whatever they're selling.
Yes.
100%. I couldn't agree more.
Robert, I wanted to ask you a question. Yeah. So from your perspective, what are some of the win-wins that an MSP can gain working with a quality MSSP? How can that strengthen their clients and the relationship? So
I'm going to answer that a different way. I'm going to focus on the client because that's what we do, right? So I think that the client gets access to, they get better focus, right? So the MSP and the MSSP in that industry should both be focused on those client requirements. We've already discussed the expertise level. Bring in an MSP, they can talk to you specific to your industry. The client also by default gains access to a far wider pool of SMEs. So, something totally unrelated might happen. The MSSP might have somebody that can answer that question for us without having to kind of go through the yellow pages. And then from an MSP perspective, and we've had this conversation a lot, you know, it comes back to a make or buy decision. An MSSP is not in competition with you. They're a partner on behalf of the client. It's all about the client at the end of the day. So you find a good MSSP, you partner with them. There's no competition there. You agree who's going to do XDR and the rest of it. Your swim lanes are pretty clearly delineated. But with an MSSP, typically, going back to the make or buy decision, as a client, you can either decide to make this yourself. Okay, I need a SOC. I'm going to hire minimum 5 people, and they all have this amount of expertise, and I need to cover 24 hours. Do you know how long that's going to take and how much that's going to cost you? A ton of money. Go to an MSSP if you need SOC as a service as part of your governance requirements. I can promise you MSSPs can stand those up for 50,000 endpoints within a day. You haven't had to hire anyone. You've got no HR obligations. You're being protected and you're being serviced from day one. So I'm pretty sure MSPs, I haven't seen very many that offer SOC as a service, just using that as an example, okay? So the service is immediate. Okay.
A quick call out for everyone. SOC is Security Operations Center, for anybody not familiar with the acronym. And then corresponding, and a lot of MSPs will work with NOC services, which is Network Operations Center.
So right,
it's kind of analogous to help desk, really.
Of that person's network, endpoints, servers, everything, to have it being monitored by like level 2 analysts, so you can have that quick response times if something happens.
Yeah. So anyway, but back to what's in it for the MSP. So the client thinks you're great because you've brought a bunch of experts in and they've been able to deliver a whole load of services immediately. So they love you. You can, now you've got this relationship, you've ostensibly expanded your capabilities as an MSP to now include all of these MSSP services. Clients tend to look for, clients want one throat to choke, or minimum throats to choke as possible, right? So if they've got to go digging around for different companies,
or one hand to hold.
Yeah, that's very politically correct of you. So all of a sudden, if they can either go to you or us, and they'll get, you know, a combined partnership answer, then guess what? Didn't we both just get a sticky client at that point? They're not going to go anywhere else. They don't need to go anywhere else. They love our joint services, and they get in quality answers and quality service all the way through. So lastly, looking at this from a client perspective, if I was back on the client side and I was talking to you as an MSP, and I asked you the question, so how do you deal with your own internal risk? And you said to me, well, I have this MSSP. Not only do we partner with them on client projects, but we've had them in to assess us as an organization across governance, risk, compliance, all of those dimensions, maybe against NIST, CSF or something. You know, if you're comfortable enough with the quality of your services as an MSP that you've been assessed yourself, that for me is a huge differentiator, and I would buy services from you because I trust you at that point. So, and then lastly, you know, pure cash, you know, we work with MSPs. If they refer us, there's referral revenue. Yeah, you didn't have to do anything other than put us in the frame. So,
important consideration to anyone that's thinking through what we were talking about here and thinking back to our starting points about contract and outsourcing of managed services or IT components. A partnership and outsourcing are a fine distinction, and understanding that, just the same as I said, you might have a specialist that does your printers, another one that does your more typical managed services, and a different that does your MSSPs, and they may have all come from the MSSP or the MSP or the printer guy. They may say, hey, these guys do well, work with them. It's important to understand, where do you demark the responsibility and who's doing what, and are they working together well? And then importantly, you want to make sure that it's not a behind the scenes scenario where there's finger pointing, or the paperwork, the scoping, the SLAs leave the end client holding the bag.
Great point, James. Great point. Well, hey, we're getting really close to the top of the hour. We got about 4 minutes left. I want to just give this time to kind of summarize, get everybody last statements, and then we'll put this one to bed. And I want to say that throat to choke in British terms is a term of endearment. So it's just a cultural thing. So
Oh, no problem at all. I have a very large neck, and you might need to use two hands, but I'm here for you.
I'm sorry, we are divided by a common language at times. So I get that. I get caught out. So.
No, it's all good. It's all good. So it's a common phrase. There's actually a local MSP that I've worked with that they tagline in the airports near us that you should work with them because they're one neck to choke, and that's actually like part of their marketing. So it's not like it's an unused phrase.
It wasn't not just me then. Good. Yeah, I mean, I've been on the client side, and sometimes you just want to know, all right, who do I need to call? And if that's as few people as possible to get an answer, then you're delighted at that point. So,
well, David, do you have
Okay.
any final statements?
Yeah, I was just gonna, comment again, being on the client side now, I'm fortunate that I have an MSSP who works hand in hand with the MSP, because this choking and hand holding and all this stuff, I'm busy trying to deliver patient care.
Right.
My core competency is delivering patient care, and no different than when James quickly stopped Robert and said, hey, let me give a call out to what SOC and NOC means. It wasn't, to be disrespectful, it was to make sure that it was a collaborative conversation here. And when I know that I have that type of collaboration behind the scenes, again, I can focus on where my core competency is, which is patient care and growth.
Appreciate it. James?
I mean, I think it's been well said here today, and I would definitely say that importantly, as any organization's assessing your need, you should start by trying to size out your expectations and ask there's a very simple starting question. Are you in an industry that has a compliance or regulation? Because if so, you might want to start the conversation with the MSSP and then get the MSP after that. But generally speaking, you want to make sure that you're considering your starting point and what are the needs of your business.
Appreciate it. Well, Robert, I'm going to turn it over to you to close us out.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thanks for everyone for joining, and James and David for being our panelists. We promised no sales pitch. By the way, David is not a client of James and vice versa. It's, there's none of that happening here. We did, there was an area that we really wanted to cover, but we kind of ran out of time a little bit around governance, risk and compliance. I touched on it a little bit. We have conversations about risk and we take them from there. We don't have conversations about tools or features of tools or anything like that. So that may actually be enough there for another webinar. So James, I know you'll join us on that, and maybe David will as well. But yeah, there's a whole world of GRC vocabulary that might be new to some folks, which might be a bit of an eye-opener. But again, we will list out the key questions, because I think that'll be useful for folks, what to ask your MSP and your MSSP. We're not going to be selective on that. These are service providers to you. Here's a list of really interesting questions for you to ask them. Okay, how can I get a better feel for the level of your services? If it were me, I'd put that in a spreadsheet, interview 5 of them and score them and weight them. But then I love spreadsheets. I'm a bit like David. I'm the numbers guy. So that's me.
If I could, if you score them, make sure you score them on how much they were able to speak to your language, not theirs. It's important.
Right. Yeah. As long as you score consistently across all of them, then you'll get your answer. Great. So it leaves me to say thank you. I know I'd like to wrap it on at the end of these. Any questions, let us know. We'll provide a list of questions. This video will be available on YouTube probably in 24 hours or so. If you have any questions about Stealth Group, chat with David and myself. Tagunia, talk to James, and if you're in Nevada in need of any dental healthcare, then have a chat with David D over there. But other than that, thanks all, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you.
Yeah, and don't forget to follow us on our YouTube channel. So we post all of our webinar series up there in Stealth Group. So thanks everybody. Have a great day.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Thanks, guys.